and welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode of the Jazz Update, Bill Evans, his life and times and best hits. So Bill Evans was famous for his development of piano technique. He was born in New Jersey, went on to major in music composition. In 1955, he started out as a full-time pianist with George Russell's band. A few years later, he joined Miles Davis' sextet, where he famously collaborated with him on the album Kind of Blue, one of the best-selling albums of all time. In 1959, he left Miles Davis' band and started out with his own trio, featuring bassist Scott LaFaro and drummer Paul Motion. One of their best albums was recorded at a live event at the famous Village Vanguard in New York City. Evans received 31 Grammy nominations and 7 awards and was inducted into the Downbeat Jazz Hall of Fame. One of his Grammys was for an iconic album called Conversations with Myself. This album was unique because it featured piano overdubbing technology, where multiple piano tracks were laced on top of each other in the tracks. Several of Evans' compositions like Waltz for Debbie and Time Remembered have become jazz classics today. So that was a bit of insight into Bill Evans, his life and times and best albums. Also coming up on today's episode of the Jazz Update, some trending festival and album news. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On today's episode of the Jazz Update, Bill Evans, one of the greatest jazz pianists of his time. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. His style went on to influence generations of musicians after him. His music was both complex and enjoyable. He started out playing the piano at age 3. By age 5, he was taking formal studies. He also became inspired by classical composers at an early age. He then joined the army for a while and after retiring decided to pursue a career in music full-time. He took up work alongside George Russell in New York City. His first album release was called New Jazz Conceptions, recorded in 1956. It was a critical album but was initially a failure. In 1957, he had his next big break when Miles Davis asked him to join his band. One of the highlights of his days with Davis was his composition Blue in Green. Another highlight, his collaboration with Davis on the timeless album Kind of Blue. In 1958, Evans recorded his second album, Everybody Digs Bill Evans, which included one of his best compositions, Peace Space. And in 1961, he formed a trio featuring himself on piano, Paul Motion on drums, and Scott LaFaro on bass. Their resulting performances were distinguished by the seamless interplay between the bandmates. The Bill Evans trio changed the face of jazz. One of their best albums came after a live event at the famous Village Vanguard in New York City, which also saw the release of one of Evans' best compositions, Waltz for Debbie. The song went on to become a jazz classic in later years. Sadly, Scott LaFaro died in a traffic accident just days after the event. Evans went into mourning and didn't record any albums for an year following the incident. He then emerged on the scene with a new trio, featuring Chuck Israels as bassist. In 1963, Evans recorded another hit album. He also received his first Grammy for the album Conversations with Myself. This album was unique because it featured piano overdubbing technology where multiple piano tracks were laced on top of each other in the tracks. His knowledge of piano technique was widespread in its range. His tone was a highlight of his playing style, full of dynamic shadings and colors. So Bill Evans preferred recording with small ensembles like his trios, but he'd also collaborate with other musicians occasionally, most famously with guitarist Jim Hall and vocalist Tony Bennett. Two of his most critically acclaimed albums alongside Bennett were the Tony Bennett Bill Evans album released in 1975 and Together Again released in 1977. In his later years, he began to experience health issues. Despite that, he recorded one of his most famous albums at the time, the Paris Concert in 1979. His friend and colleague Gene Lees has called these concerts the best and highest examples of his art to be found on record. Evans received 31 Grammy nominations and 7 awards and was inducted into the Downbeat Jazz Hall of Fame. He died in 1980, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest jazz pianists in history. Several of Evans' compositions, like Waltz for Debbie and Time Remembered, have become jazz classics today. So that was an insight into Bill Evans' biography, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about Bill Evans, his life and times, and best music. And now for some promo news. Jacob Johnson is a rising guitarist in the jazz world, and his single Jessica was released on June 21st this year. A spiritually uplifting version of the song of the same title by the Allman Brothers. So the story goes that the original song was a tribute to songwriter Dickie Betts' daughter, Jessica. It was released in 1973 in the album Brothers and Sisters. Jessica went on to debut at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 a few months later. It also won a Grammy for Best Rock Instrumental Performance. So the songwriter behind the original version, Dickie Betts, died on April 18 this year. And Jacob Johnson's one of his biggest fans. He came up with a rendition of this song as a tribute to the great composer. So that was some trending music news right there, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Bill Evans' best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, Bill Evans, his life and times and best hits. On this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Trio 64. In 1963, Bill recorded Trio 64 alongside Paul Motion on drums and bassist Gary Peacock, an album exclusively full of jazz classics. Waltz for Debbie, another great album, it's one of his best-selling albums. Bill Evans recorded this album in his early days in 1961. So this album was recorded towards the end of a famous live concert at the Village Vanguard in New York City. The album contains 6 tracks taken from that live event, a vibrant, dynamic album. Moonbeams is the next album. This album is a compilation of ballads, a classic piano trio album. Chuck Israel is a guest star on this album, and the tracks here represent the definition of lush contemplative jazz. And the Paris Concert. This album was inspired by Evans' desire to make an album where all the instrumentals had equal weight in the tracks. And there's a lot of synchronicity and harmony in the instrumentals as a result. Overall, a very relaxing, enticing album. So that was a quick recap of what we're going to be talking about on this hour, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, Bill Evans, his life and times and best albums. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Trio 64. This album was recorded in the 60s when Bill Evans was at his peak. He had just joined Verve Records after a successful series of recordings like Moonbeams and How My Heart Sings. He recorded several notable albums with the label, including the Grammy Award-winning Conversations with Myself. In 1963, he recorded Trio 64 alongside Paul Motion on drums and bassist Gary Peacock. A notable feature of this album was that it had Peacock on bass rather than Chuck Israels. Also, the compilation of songs on this album is a bit unusual. Evans' albums typically comprised a mix-up of standards and original compositions, but this album is exclusively jazz classics. For example, the opening track, a theme from a 40s cartoon called Little Lulu. Also, a rather whimsical take on Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Overall, a very engaging, fascinating album. Waltz for Debbie is the next album. So there was once a survey for the best Bill Evans albums of all time, and Waltz for Debbie was one of the top picks. It's one of his best-selling albums that's been that way for 60 years. Bill Evans recorded this album in his early days in 1961. He'd been collaborating at the time with artists like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, and more. So this album was recorded towards the end of his famous live concert at the Village Vanguard in New York City. This album contains 6 tracks taken from that live event. LaFaro and Motion's accompaniment was more than just background music for the great pianist. Motion's drumming is spot on. LaFaro practically reinvents the role of double bass in a piano trio. His bass sounds like piano or guitar accompaniment at times. Victor Young's My Foolish Heart is a standout track here, with Evans slowing down the pace to make it sound more romantic. The Tour Ahead, another jazz classic made famous by Billie Holiday. Also, Leonard Bernstein's Some Other Time. In this song, LaFaro and Evans take turns to flesh out the melody. One of the highlights on the Miles Davis track Milestone is the energetic cymbal playing by LaFaro, a vibrant, dynamic album. Moonbeams is the next album. This album is a compilation of ballads. It's a beautiful piece of art, a classic piano trio album. Chuck Israels is a guest star on this album. He's especially great on the song Polka Dots and Moonbeams. Perfect synchronization for Evans, playing very innovatively. This album also showcases Evans at his best as a band leader. And the tracks here represent the definition of lush contemplative jazz, especially Evans' originals like A Person I Knew and Very Early, that define his approach to the genre. A standout track from this album, Stairway to the Stars, a Glenn Miller classic. It's got a great melody and Evans reharmonizes it beautifully in this album. And yet, it's not just the theme that makes this track timeless, it's Evans improvising throughout the track. His playing is characterized by how he creates momentum, and then suddenly breaks and starts over again. And an album called The Paris Concert. On this album, Mark Johnson's on bass, Joe LaBarbera's on drums. This album was inspired by Evans' desire to make an album where all the instrumentals had equal weight in the tracks, and there's a lot of synchronization and harmony in the instrumentals as a result. The album opens up with Paul Simmons' classic Do It For Your Love. The song opens up with a beautiful piano solo, then Evans is joined by the other two as they take on this very emotional song. Similar songs with that sense of nostalgia, emotional and sensitive songs include My Romance, I Loves You, Porgy, Up With The Lark, All Mine and Beautiful Love. Overall, this one's a relaxing, enticing album. So that was some insight into more of Bill Evans' best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, it's about Bill Evans, his life and times, and best hits. And now for some jazz festival news. The world's biggest jazz festival is back. The Montreal International Jazz Festival is underway. It started on June 27th and is going on until the 6th of July. Featuring 350 shows from indoor concerts to open-air shows, and two-thirds of the festival events are free to enter. This year's festival features a star-studded lineup like Andre 3000, Nora Jones, Loewe, Robert Glasper, Freddie Gibbs, and more. The history of the Montreux Jazz Festival goes back to 1980 when it was founded to bring together the world's best jazz musicians together in one Grand Slam event. The festival also holds a Guinness World Record as the largest jazz festival in the world. For more information, please visit www.montrealjazzfest.com. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Bill Evans' best albums of all time. Stay tuned.